Good day, everyone. Our lecture for today is about understanding religious experiences. So, our learning outcomes for today is first to understand religious experience as the object of the philosophy of religion. Second, to identify the essential structures revealed by the phenomenological consideration of religion in terms of the Numinous and the self. And third, to appreciate Rudolf Otto's analysis of the Numinous as an example of the phenomenological approach to religion. And our text for today is Rudolf Otto's idea of the holy, published in 1917. So just to give a brief background about who Rudolf Otto is, he was born in Germany and became an eminent philosopher, theologian, and scholar of religion. For his studies, he did a dissertation on Martin Luther's understanding of the Holy Spirit at the universities of Erlangen and Göttingen in Germany. And he toured around the world as a scholar of religion. And his most famous work was Das Heilige. So Otto's analysis is a very good example of the phenomenological description of religion. In terms of the noema, or what we call as the object, the nous is the experience itself and the self. Otto's analysis represented the attempt to go beyond the limitations of the rationalistic and moralistic accounts of the explanation of religious phenomenon. And in contrast to this bias, he advocated the primacy of the analysis of feelings as the way to properly understand the religious experiences of people. There are two criticisms against this approach. First, the focus on feelings tended to privilege mysticism as the only proper form of religious experience, when in fact there can also be others, for example, worship, prayer, sacrifice, etc. Religion is something wider than mysticism, which is usually taken as the exceptional or abnormal. Second, there is also the danger of a subjectivist interpretation of religious experience. The emphasis on feelings may lead us to lose sight of the character of religious experience as something objective, studying mere religiosity as opposed to religion. Here we can generally define mysticism as the experience of being one with God or the Absolute, which is manifested in altered states of consciousness that is interpreted to be imbued with religious or spiritual significance. Otto's aim in his work is to be concerned with examining the nature of those elements in the religious experience which lie outside and beyond the scope of reason, which cannot be comprised in ethical categories. This element is found in all forms of religious experiences and not only in mysticism. So let's go into the discussion of religious feelings. For Rudolf Otto, religious feeling is a fundamental datum of human consciousness which is present when we have a sense of the presence of an objective reality, the perception of which is something that we cannot reduce to our ordinary sensual and intellectual faculties. Religious feeling thus involves a unique kind of apprehension sui generis that cannot be reduced to ordinary intellectual or rational knowing. Nevertheless, it is itself a genuine kind of feeling, though one which we may term to be a non-rational response by the human mind to the divine, whether clearly seen or obscurely. Here, the term rational means something that can be thought conceptually by the human mind. Concepts are what can be grasped by the intellect, analyzed by thought, and be expressed through definition. The Christian God, for example, is expressed and understood as a rational nature. However, that is not all that there is to God. For example, God as being true, good, beautiful, etc. There is always something more to God, that is the non-rational that is apprehended by the religious feeling. So rationality cannot exhaust the reality of God because by and in itself, the human mind is limited. When the mind is confronted by the divine, it is ruptured by an object that it cannot contain or grasp. The divine reality is something that exceeds the mind. What is revealed in this feeling is the encounter of the human soul with something that is known gradually, primarily, as a transcendent beyond, even as it is also felt as an immanent within. So we can contrast this analysis against Friedrich Schleiermacher's idea of the feeling of dependence. Otto criticized Schleiermacher's idea of feeling of dependence by saying that religious feeling cannot be reduced to a feeling of dependence because a feeling of dependence is qualitatively different from the properly religious feeling. Feeling of dependence is essentially a feeling that occurs by virtue of the subject's personal insufficiency and impotence as being determined by the circumstances of the environment. As such, events other than the religious may cause it. On the other hand, the numinous experience is essentially characterized by creature feeling that is not a matter of personal imagination but something occasioned or caused by an object outside the self. Creature feeling is the emotion of a creature abased and overwhelmed by its own nothingness insofar as it is affected by its immediate and primary reference to an object outside the self. Creature feeling may thus include the feeling of dependence, but not only it. What Ott is trying to say is that it has intentional reference to an object which is considered supreme among all other objects. Creature feeling thus arises in us when the numinous is experienced as something present and the mind turns to it spontaneously, making us realize that the numinous is subjective and something outside the self. The problem with Schleiermacher's distinction between absolute and relative dependence is the failure to distinguish between them, an intrinsic quality which should point religious feeling to an object that is outside of and other than itself. His distinction merely pointed to a difference in degree of religious feeling. So, what are some descriptions of the religious feeling? So, we can outline at least four at this point. First, there's the feeling of the uncanny. Second, the thrill of awe or reverence. Third, the sense of dependence, impotence, or nothingness. And lastly, feelings of rapture and exaltation. So for Rudolf Otto, the religious feeling is a mode of knowing sui generis that comprehends an object that is itself sui generis. When we say sui generis, it means one of a kind. Religious feeling is something irreducible to other modes of knowing. That is, a knowing that is autonomous and unique. Otto thinks that the object which corresponds to the proper religious feeling is the holy or the sacred inasmuch as it is without the ethical import. In other words, it is a sense of the holy beyond what ethical religious norms would usually designate by the term religious. Otto calls this object the numinous, the holy or the sacred, independent of the category of the good, plus the added element of something extra, the ineffable, or in Greek, to apeton. So the word numinous comes from the Latin word numen, the most general Latin word for supernatural divine power. Other terms for the divine or sacred are the following: heilig in German, the Hebrew kadosh, the Greek agios, and the Latin sanctus or sacer. So the luminous feeling is the unique apprehension of a something whose character at first seems to have little connection with our ordinary moral terms, but which later becomes charged with the highest moral significance. Religious feeling in all its varying ideas and feelings is characteristically underlined by the holy as its typical element. The distinctive religious experience is the numinous experience. So the holy is not exactly equivalent with the numinous. For Otto, the holy seems to be a complex category of the numinous and the moral. Metaphor, a fabric in which we have the non-rational luminous experience as the woof and the rational and the ethical as the warp. The numinous cannot be thought, but can only be evoked or awakened in the mind, as everything that comes of the spirit must be awakened. So what are the elements of the numinous? The utilized objective description of the numinous was the formulation given as mysterium tremendum et fascinans. The nature of the numinous is such that it grips or steers the human mind with this and that determinate affective state. So the feeling of mysterium tremendum is a feeling which may come at times like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mode of deepest worship. Sometimes it becomes a thrilling and vibrant state of the soul which might lead one into frenzy and ecstasy, or into grisly horror and trembling, or into something beautiful, pure, and glorious. Okay. Second element, just to explain this, is what we call as the mysterium. Conceptually, it denotes that which is merely hidden and esoteric, that which is beyond conception or understanding, extraordinary, and familiar. This negative description, however, points to something that is absolutely and intensely positive. Since this object is absolutely greater than the human perceiver, it becomes an object of awe and dread. There is also an element of awfulness. Awe here refers to the feeling of marvel that results in us when we encounter an object that is not within our ordinary field of perception and which overwhelms us with its greatness. Dread, on the other hand, refers to something other than ordinary fear, instead to the peculiar feeling gripped by a terror fraught with an inward shuddering that can only be instilled in us by a being infinitely greater than us, an object not contained within our ordinary experience, but spectral or ghostly. Shuddering is more than ordinary natural fear. Rather, it implies that the mysterium has started to loom before the mind to touch the feelings. Next is the element of the tremendum, which refers to the aspect of the numinous which causes dread in us to shudder before the mystery, such that even the body is affected, hair bristle and limbs quake. Here, what is meant by demonic dread is a crudely naive and primordial emotional disturbance which underlies all primitive religions that can ultimately develop into higher numinous emotions. So the religious feeling has the mysterium tremendum as its object. It is a combination of the mystical awe and shuddering dread that accompanies creature feeling, the feeling of personal nothingness and abasement before the awe-inspiring object directly experienced. What is described as the luminous is not a merely intellectual concept, but one which escapes categorization through concepts. This is the reason it is called as the infinitely transcendent. Thus, what we are presenting is not a proper concept, but an ideogram of the luminous in terms of its absolute unapproachability. Maya stars. At this point, however, we must keep in mind that the object of religious feeling is described through mere conceptual analogy. What is described as the numinous is not a merely intellectual concept, but one which escapes categorization through concepts. This is the reason it is also called as the infinitely transcendent. Thus, what we are presenting is not a proper concept, but an ideogram of the numinous in terms of its absolute unapproachability. The next element is what we call as majestas or overpoweringness. Majestas refers to that element of power and might that characterizes the numinous as awful majesty. The numinous as absolute power overwhelms us in such a way that it creates in us impotence, the feeling of one's own abasement of being but dust and ashes and general nothingness. This is the ground for what we call as religious humility. This is what Otto also calls as a status creature as opposed to the fact of having been created. This feeling of impotence and generalized nothingness further brings us to the realization of the characteristic note of mysticism in all its forms. First, the annihilation of the self, or what we call as self-depreciation, and second, the recognition of the transcendent as the soul and entire reality. This non-conceptual form of knowledge consists of the consciousness of the absolute superiority of a power other than the self. When it is understood ontologically, we grasp that this plenitude of power is itself transmuted into a plenitude of being. This should not be understood in terms of mystical identification, God in the self as one. And the last element is what we call as the element of energy or urgency. The energy or urgency of the numinous object refers to that sense of force which it itself urgent, active, compelling, and alive that makes the religious experience of the creature as something living and vigorous. This energy is non-rational and can only be understood as an ideogram for that reality of God that concretely affects and transforms individuals into authentic religious beings. This energy is itself beyond utterance and can only be expressed symbolically in terms of the daimonic. So the qualities of Mysterium Tremendum point to an important difference between the mysterious character of the Numinous as opposed to its awful character. It might be possible, however, that only one of these elements becomes present in the encounter with the Numinous, as in the case when the element of the Tremendum occupies the mind apart from the mysterious. This is what we call as stupor. Stupor is plainly a different thing from tremor. It signifies blank wonder, an astonishment that strikes as chill and numb, amazement absolute. So the truly mysterious object is an object beyond our apprehension and comprehension, not only because our knowledge has certain irremovable limits, but because in it we come upon something inherently wholly other, whose kind and character are incommensurable with our own, and before which we therefore recall in a way that strikes as chill and numb. So here we have two senses of the mysterium, the natural sense and the religious sense. In the natural sense, mysterium means a secret or mystery about a thing that appears alien to us, uncomprehended and unexplained. In this sense, mysterium is an ideogram, an analogical notion, ultimately incapable of exhausting out the real meaning of the numinous. In the religious sense, as we have already explained, is the mysterium is understood as the holy other, that which is quite beyond the sphere of the usual, the intelligible and the familiar, which therefore falls quite outside the limits of the canny, and is contrasted with it, filling the mind with blank wonder and astonishment. The holy other is not a product of our fancy, but something which has no place in our ordinary perceptual scheme. It grasps hold of the mind in an altogether different manner by arousing an irrepressible interest in the mind. In this way, we understand the luminous object as something contrasted to everything wanted and familiar, which makes it as something supernatural, supramundane, that is above the whole world order. So the sense of the holy order explains the meaning of the beyond, the epikeina in Greek, inherent to all authentic religion. Although explained negatively, what the ideogram denotes is a wholly positive conception of a transcendent alter reality that is over and beyond our ordinary world. And for this reason, there is also the element of fascinance that we have to consider in the numinous. So the fascinance is the element of the numinous that makes it uniquely attractive and fascinating. The numinous does not only evoke dread and awe, but also attracts and charms. It is the Dionysian element of the numinous. And according to Otto, the demonic divine object may appear to the mind an object of horror and dread, but at the same time, it is no less something that allures with a potent charm. And the creature who trembles before it, utterly cowed and cast down, has always at the same time the impulse to turn to it, nay, even to make it somehow his own. The mystery is not only something to be wondered at, but something that enhances the person, that bewilders and confounds, that captivates and transports one into a strange ravishment to the point of dizzy intoxication. At its highest point of stress, the fascinating becomes the overabounding, the mystical moment which exactly corresponds upon this line to the epikeina, upon either line of approach, and which is to be understood accordingly. By via imminentiae, The numinous or the divine is the highest, strongest, best, loveliest, and dearest that man can think of. By via negationis, however, God is not merely the ground and the superlative of all that there is. We will explain these two ways, the eminent way and the negative way, in our next lessons. We can also think of the numinous as the monstrous, or in German, the ungeheuer. The numinous can also be thought of as the monstrous. It can be thought through a combination of the weird, uncanny, connoting the sense of greatness in quantitative size. So finally, we can go into a summary of our lecture for today. So we can say that Otto calls the object of religious experience as the numinous, defined as the mysterious tremendum et fascinans. The holy is not exactly equivalent with the numinous because for Otto, the holy seems to be a complex category of the numinous and the moral. Again, the metaphor stands as a fabric in which you have the non-rational luminous experience as the woof and the rational and the ethical as the warp. Another point to note is to say that the luminous is both rational and non-rational. The psychological conditions to enter religious experience in the luminous, which is non-rational, is expressed in rational ideas. So the religious experience is a category sui generis which cannot be reduced to any ordinary knowing, intellectual or rational. It is a unique original feeling response which can be in itself ethically neutral and claims consideration in its own right. This special feeling which characterizes the religious experience cannot be the psychological outcome of a thrill or enthusiasm. Religious feelings, therefore, are not simply psychological modes, but are modes of apprehending the divine. And for our last point, the numinous is a mystery that cannot be grasped in its entirety using rational concepts or elements alone. This is something that is emphasized unmistakably in every type of religion. So to push this point further, the divine is called the mystery, the inexpressible, the totally other, the beyond. However, since the experience of the divine is a human experience, it finds expressions in symbols which are of a profane sphere, by means of which the divine is attained. Simply, this means that the divine cannot be fully comprehended by the human mind. And third, the supremely holy is the absolutely holy. All the others are holy only insofar as they participate in the holiness of the supreme object of religious experiences. So to end this lecture, let me just give you 2 points for our class discussion next meeting. First, in Otis analysis, what guarantees that our religious experiences are not simply a product of our minds or imagination? And second, illustrate Otis analysis using examples from your own experience or that of others from the literature or data. You can use films, books, etc. that you are or other materials that you are familiar with. So much for this lecture. I hope to see you next meeting, and we will continue with our next lecture about the philosophical approaches on how to understand religious experiences. Thank you and good day.